I don't know if you've ever studied about the story of Jeptha, but I want to ask you a question. Did God do Jeptha wrong? Now, Sunday night, a week or so ago, we studied on Samuel and his mother, and how that Samuel's mother took him to serve God all of his life. Then, a couple of weeks before that, we studied on other things that related to this subject. But I thought that we ought to talk about or study about vows made to God and how they affected the individuals who made them. If you look at Judges 11, 29 through 40, and we'll go through and have some letters on pronunciation, but that's all right. Look, I don't ever fault anybody because they can't read these words, because they're not exactly what you learn in grammar school. And the pronunciation is a little strange to our ears. In Judges, the 11th chapter. Are you with me? Let me get my Bible there, and we will get started. The children of Israel had an enemy, and of course they had a leader or a judge, which basically was a king. And this enemy or this king had not allowed them to pass through their land. In Joshua, the 11th chapter, and we'll start verse 16. I didn't want Bobby to have to read too much. So Joshua took all the land and the hills, and all the south country, and all the land of Goshen, and the valley, and the plain, and the mountains of Israel, and the valley of the same. Even from Mount Halak, that goeth up to Seir, even unto Baal-gad, in the valley of Lebanon, under Mount Hermon. And all the kings he took, and smote them, and slew them. Joshua made war a long time with all these kings. And there was not a city that made peace with the children of Israel, save the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. All other they took in battle. For it was of the Lord to harden their hearts, and that they should not come against Israel in battle, that he might destroy them utterly, and that they might have no favor, but that he might destroy them, and the Lord commanded, as the Lord commanded Moses. And at that time came Joshua and cut off the Anakim from the mountains. So you remember the Anakims? You remember our boy Goliath? Goliath was an Anakim. Goliath had 3 or 4 brothers. The one that I remember that was stranger than all of them had 6 fingers and 6 toes. Now, if you've ever run up against about an 11-foot man, that's enough to impress you. But one that had 6 fingers and 6 toes would be more so. So the Anakims they came up against. And at the time came Joshua and cut off the Anakim from the mountains, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the mountains of Judah, and from the mountains of Israel. Joshua destroyed them utterly with their cities. And there was none of the Anakim left in the land of the children of Israel, only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod there remained. So Joshua took the whole land, and according to all that the Lord said, and Moses, and Joshua gave it an inheritance unto Israel according to their divisions by their tribes, and the land rested from war. Now, let's go to Judges. That was Joshua. Because I had to read that to you so we'll be ready for today or tonight's study. In Judges 11, we'll start with verse 29. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jeptha, And he passed over Gilead and Manasseh, and passed over Mizpah of Gilead. And from Mizpah of Gilead he passed over into the children of Ammon. And Jeptha vowed a vow unto the Lord, and said, If thou wilt without fail deliver the children of Ammon into mine hands, then it shall be, that whatsoever cometh forth of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the children of Ammon, shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. So Jeptha passed over unto the children of Ammon to fight against them. And the Lord delivered them into his hands. And he smote them from Azor, even until thou comest to Minnith, even 20 cities, and unto the plain of the vineyards, and with a very great slaughter. Thus the children of Ammon were subdued before the children of Israel. And Jeptha came to Mizpah unto his house. And behold, his daughter came out to meet him with timbrels and with dances. And she was his only child. Beside her he had neither son nor daughter. And it came to pass when he saw her, that he rent his clothes, and said, Alas, my daughter, thou hast brought me very low, and thou art one of them that trouble me. For I have opened my mouth unto the Lord, and I cannot go back. And she said unto him, My father, if thou hast opened thy mouth unto the Lord, do to me according to that which hath proceeded out of thy mouth. For as much as the Lord hath taken vengeance for thee of thine enemies, even of the children of Ammon. And she said unto her father, Let this thing be done for me. Let me alone 2 months, that I may go up and down upon the mountains and bewail my virginity, I and my fellows. And he said, Go. And he sent her away for 2 months. And she went with her companions, and bewailed her virginity upon the mountains. And it came to pass at the end of 2 months that she returned unto her father, who did with her according to his vow which he had vowed. And she knew no man. And it was a custom in Israel, that the daughters of Israel went yearly to lament the daughter of Jeptha the Gileadite 4 days in a year. Don't know if you've read this story. I got to talking to Linda about it. And there's a lot of things here that have been included in sermons I've preached in the last 2 or 3 weeks that maybe I should have started here with this kind of a study than have preached them. Why was it not fair, or why was it fair, that God took Samuel from his mother after she weaned him, and he stayed in the temple all of his life with Eli? Why was it right that there were some things that people made vows about to God, that those vows were, as the Bible calls it, redeemed? Or in other words, you could buy them off or buy them back. And why were other things not redeemable? The first thing I want you to see is the war against the Ammonites that Jeptha was worried about. The problem with Jeptha is that he had no faith. He wanted to bargain with God. As the leader in Judges of the children of Israel, instead of having to bargain with God and make him an offer, he should have just gone to God and asked for help. And therefore, whatever his help would have been what God rewarded. Instead of Jeptha thinking that he had something to do with it, it was only a blessing from God. By the Lord's leading us, Jeptha cried, we can fight this major battle, and the Ammonites will be won, but it's because of a bargain that I've made with the Lord. There's a lot of times, as children of God live in Christ, they make vows. They get so overwhelmed with a desire, like Samuel's mother, that they will make a vow to God and sometimes act as though that vow should not be kept or is too strong to be kept. We many times have not taken seriously a vow that we've made to the Lord. The vow that Jeptha made was not well thought out. Jeptha could not control, and he won the battle, and he did, who it was going to be that would come out of his door when he first came back for a victory celebration. And since he was letting chance determine what he would be offering, he was showing lack of respect to the commandments of the law of Moses that he'd made concerning things that could be offered to God. Now, if there's one thing we know, sure of, we know that God despises human sacrifice. But the first thing that was going to be given to God because of the victory was supposed to be his daughter offered as a sacrifice. The sacrificing of children to idols carried the death penalty amongst the Jews. You want to look at it, it's Leviticus the 20th chapter, the first 5 verses, or Jeremiah the 7th chapter, verses 31 and 32. In fact, God had gone so far in Jeremiah to say that this was something that had not even come into his mind. This was so horrible. What were they doing with their children? They were offering them as burnt offerings on the arms of Molech, the god, and burning them alive on those arms. See, Molech was a god made by the Philistines that had arms extended. And the fire of this god extended through the arms, so that anybody or anything that touched those arms would actually and literally be burnt to death. And so what the Philistines were doing was showing their service to their god Molech, and that they were offering their children there. And so the children of Israel thought, well, gee, if they can show that to their God, we'll show that to ours. And so they began to offer their children as sacrifices. God hated that. He stopped that immediately. And God said in Deuteronomy, the 12th chapter, the 29th through the 31st verse, "You shall not worship me as these nations serve their gods, for they burn even their sons and their daughters in fire to gods." So why would God allow Jeptha to win a battle after making such a vow to offer a human being? Many times people don't understand. In the heat of the battle, in the fear of the enemy, and the circumstance of, we don't know Jephtha's army. We don't know the Ammonites' army. We don't know their ability to fight. But Jeptha felt so severely uneven with the Ammonites. He was going to make a vow to God that was obviously not well thought about, and therefore not something he should have done. But you know what's interesting? If you'll turn to Hebrews 11, verse 32, you'll find Jeptha in the honor roll of the faithful, placed right along by King David. So Jeptha was not a bad man. He was not an evil man. If you can say anything about Jeptha that you want to say, just said Jeptha just didn't have enough sense to believe in God. And so he made a deal with God. Now there's one thing about making a deal with God. When you vow a vow to God, you'd better be planning on keeping your end of the bargain, because he will never forget his. not only better keep your end of the bargain, you better stop and give a whole lot of thought with who you're making a covenant with, because God keeps his covenants in every generation. Maybe we better study about vowing to God. Sin offering was given when a person unintentionally sinned in Leviticus 4. The guilt or trespass offerings were given when one person unintentionally had the possibility of making restitution and did not do so in Leviticus 5. Peace offerings were the last offerings made before a person can go and have fellowship with God in any form. In a peace offering, the one making the offering can choose whatever was to be offered. But when you offered a burnt offering, which was a fourth type, that burnt offering was when a person gave everything wholly to God. Now, all other offerings involved burning portions, but the burnt offering was the whole thing that was determined. There were dedication offerings that were given, but the thing I want you to know tonight is that the burnt offering was the thing that Jeptha had promised. The burnt offering was to be the offerings of the children of Israel for sin and guilt and dedication were done daily. And they were things that were a part of their normal course of life. But when it became something that was done for a vow and was to be offered as a burnt offering, there were involved in that rules and regulations that were not a part of anything else. Just so you know, Jesus is said to be a burnt offering. We know that his death at Calvary was not something that caused his body to be burnt. But we also know that Paul likens it to such because he gave himself wholly. Look at Ephesians 5 in verse 2. Unto the Lord. And when I preached last Sunday morning on present your bodies a living sacrifice, there's a lot of people that didn't understand what I meant as the scriptures talk about the sacrifice that we offer ourselves to God in being. And now it may mean more to you. There are special rules, though, for vowed sacrifices. That night when I preached on Samuel, many times people don't understand why this was such an austere thing. Anything that was given to the Lord in a vow could be redeemed or bought back. You can find that in Leviticus 27. However, there were certain things that could not be redeemed because they already belonged to the Lord. Now, if it was a sacrifice of an animal and it was offered to God, then you could sacrifice certain parts or portions of it. But if it was a sacrifice because of a vow of a piece of property or land, that could be redeemed. But when it was a vow that was made for service to God in his tabernacle or temple, it was something that could not be bought back or redeemed and had to be fulfilled as God commanded. Now, the reason Samuel could not be redeemed is that Samuel was the firstborn son. He was a Levite. He already belonged to the Lord. So when his mother Hannah offered Samuel in vow to God, she already offered to God what was already his. And because she made this vow, he could not be redeemed or bought back. So the Bible shows that a child that was redeemed, if he was not the firstborn son, could be redeemed. But if it belonged to the Lord anyway, you couldn't buy back what already belonged to the Lord before you made the vow and included them in that vow. In other words, you can't bargain with what ain't yours. So when she made this vow, it was something she had to do. Maybe you didn't pay any attention as we were reading, but Jeptha's daughter was all that he had. He didn't have a son or a daughter other than hers. She was the only child. She belonged to the Lord. She was a righteous person, as far as we can tell. And she was the only way that Jeptha could have kept his name as king or leader of the children of Israel if she was no longer in service as a means of showing glory to God by a free and willing spirit. Jeptha's seed remaining as king was now gone. He said to Jeptha, Jeptha said to his daughter, "Today you have brought me very low. I will never have a seed being king in Israel." When a child was vowed to the Lord and it could not be redeemed, there was one thing that happened that explains some other things we may not have understood exactly, which I hope we'll be able to put in place tonight. When it was vowed to the Lord and could not be redeemed, it was placed wholly, full-time, and totally in service to God. Now, there were many services that Jewish women involved themselves in as they performed at the door of the tabernacle. There's 2 or 3 names that are kind of famous in our repertoire. One now could be added to that we may not have known was there, and that was Jeptha's daughter. This did not mean that he took Jeptha, killed her, put her on an altar, and set fire to her body to offer her to God. What this meant was that he was offering her in full-time service to God, not as a commitment from her, but as a commitment of him as her father. It took away from her rights as a female in the Jewish nation, one of which was marriage and reproduction, therefore ensuring that Jeptha would never be king or have a continuation of such in his lineage. The same was true in Samuel. 1 Samuel 2 and 1 Samuel 1, we see the story of these people who gave the total whole life of these people in service. Now, maybe we didn't pay attention to it, but in the book of John, the 18th chapter, when Jesus was taken to the high priest's house the night of his betrayal, the Bible says in the 16th or 17th verse that a woman opened the door. Maybe that didn't give you too much of a understanding, but these women were often noted in history of the Jewish people as doorkeepers, and they functioned in that capacity. And there were some that waited on the place of the building of the temple that functioned in that capacity. One of the most pronounced one is one that waited on the Lord's temple when Jesus came, as he was brought in by Mary and John and his father Joseph. Her name was Anna. If I'm not mistaken, she had been in the temple service for some 80 years and had worked wholly and totally in cleanliness or whatever the need was, washing the dishes, keeping the floor clean, keeping things prepared, arranging the order of things. In other words, there were many jobs that these women did, not as nuns. Now, frankly, that's where the Roman Catholic tried to pick up on this. But they were there because of a vow of someone else from God. Anna stayed at the temple and served the Lord. In fact, I think it's in Luke 2 when Jesus was brought in by, I'll turn over there right quick, was brought in by Joseph and Mary. And we find this Anna, and I don't know if you've ever studied about this or not, but it won't take but a second. It says here, and there was one Anna, a prophetess, a daughter of Phanuel. Now, that's all I know about Phanuel. I don't know the circumstances of the situations. Of the tribe of Asher. She was of a great age and had lived with a husband 7 years from her virginity. And she was a widow of about 84 years, 84 years of age, which departed not from the temple, but served God with fastings and prayers night and day. Now this will give you a little better understanding of what this Anna did. This will give you a little better idea of why she did it. This will help you know that there were people who actually had functions of service, but those who were given totally and wholly by vow were they who had certain functions that they worked with and were in control of in the temple that other people didn't do. So this kind of gives you the idea. So what happened to Jeptha's daughter? Well, if Jeptha had made a wise counseled vow, he would not have taken a chance on pot luck. He would not have made a vow to God. God, if you'll do this, I'll guarantee I'll do this. Because you see, Jeptha didn't have any control of who's going to come out of that door first. He didn't have any control of what it would be. Maybe he thought it was an animal, which wouldn't be too much of a thought. Maybe he thought it was some sheep. Maybe I don't know what he thought. But whatever it was, he didn't and could not guarantee, because he'd been away to battle. And when he got home, with the joy of victory in his heart and the thrill of being a servant of God, he was destroyed by what he saw coming out the front door. Coming out the front door was his one and only child. She was, as we can understand it, very near and dear to Jeptha. But what he did was place her in a function of servitude where she could be with the Levitical women and serve God in the temple all of her life, and could never be married. Now you can see how the Roman Catholics try to make a play on this, but you see, these people who, as I understand it, become nuns are they who do the volunteering themselves. Somebody doesn't do it for them. Be that as it may, this was true in Israel and did take place in the life of Jeptha and his daughter. So I ask you the question, did God do Jeptha wrong? When Jeptha made this vow with God, when he made this covenant, when he made this agreement, and then God did what he said he would do in his part, wasn't it only right? Wasn't it only just? Wasn't it something that we need to know? That when we make vows to God, we better be planning on keeping them. I've had people that come to me and have said, Joe, if we could just have a child, or if we could have a male child, then we will vow a vow to God that we will make him a preacher of the gospel. Now, that's a great thing that actually occurred in my life, but it was something that had nothing to do with the law of Moses. It was just something that my parents dedicated my brother and I to do. It was something that I was told all my life, from the time I was a little boy until I became a man. It wasn't forced. It was expected. It wasn't something that would be dishonorable, but it was the greatest desire of her heart, my mother, that I become a preacher of the gospel. When you vow a vow to God, which, as I understand it, they made, You have to carry out that vow. And it's not unfair, and it's not wrong. But it has to be something that's totally and wholly in service to God. And being totally and wholly in service to God, God doesn't owe you for that. And God doesn't advance you anything for that purpose. Now, and in closing, listen to this phrase. And you've heard me quote this before. And now, every time I hope you hear me quote it, you might have just a little bit of this sermon in your mind. Ready? But God, who separated me from my mother's womb, and who desired to give me his grace. This is the Apostle Paul explaining the vow of a Jewish mother, more than likely, dedicating her son that was not yet, because we know that she had a daughter, but dedicating or vowing her son to be a preacher of the gospel from the time he was separated from her womb. So Paul said, necessity is laid upon me, and woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. You see how these things add up and how they make things make sense and how you understand things that before you wouldn't have understood. Hannah offered this kid, and somebody said, man, that's kind of cruel. After you wean him, you take him to the temple and turn your back and go home. That was a vow that she made to God, and she kept it. She'd come to see him about once a year. And other than that, she left him alone, stayed out of his business. Paul, assuming that that's what the reference is as the Holy Spirit inspired him to write, and you can assume that, I think, had something that he was telling us that we might not have known. Now, we know that his sister was older than him. We know that because she had a son who was in Jerusalem who saved Paul's life. We also know that they may not have had a dedication to Christ, but they had a dedication to the family. And they had a dedication to the vow that was made by the parents. But what they didn't have was a son. And without a son, there was nothing that could be given to God totally and wholly as a minister of his word. Now listen again. But God, who separated me from my mother's womb, called me by his grace. I was called to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. So, helpfully, you'll understand a little bit more about vows and a little bit more about more offerings. There were a lot of times when people would vow a vow and give in exchange a piece of property. Hey, that belonged to the Lord. You say, well, what did the Lord need with that property? He didn't need it, but you know what they did with that property? They turned around and gave it to the priesthood. So these vows were different and had many consequences in Israel. And we don't want to look at them lightly. So when we come across the vow to Samuel, or we come across the other vows in the Old Testament, and I think this vow of Paul or Saul of Tarsus in the New Testament, we can then understand why Paul would say, necessity is laid upon me, and woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. If you're here and need to respond to the invitation of the gospel, Jesus said, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. Will you come as we stand and sing?